Hello! James Lindsayn haastattelu tulossa ihan kohta, mutta sitä ennen muutama alkusana. Niille, jotka eivät ehkä tiedä, kenestä on kysymys, niin James Lindsay on amerikkalainen mielipidevaikuttaja, äänekäs woke-aktivismin vastustaja, alun perin matemaatikko. James Lindsay tunnetaan kaikkein parhaiten hänen tekemästään feministisiin, aloihin kohdistuneesta tiedehuijauksesta. Hän nimittäin oli osa kolmehenkistä ryhmää, joka vuosina 2017 ja 2018 tekaisi tutkimusartikkeleita 20 kappaletta ja lähetti ne alansa johtaviin feministisiin tiedelehtiin. Näistä 20 artikkelista 7 julkaistiin, 7 hylättiin ja 6 niistä oli niin sanotusti prosessissa siinä vaiheessa, kun tämä ryhmä jäi tekemisistään kiinni. Ja by the way, ryhmä jäi tekemisistään kiinni, koska amerikkalainen toimittaja kiinnitti tähän huomiota, ei siksi, että näissä lehdissä itsessään olisi tajuttu varsinaisesti yhtään mitään. Nämä julkaistut artikkelit olivat käsittämättömän absurdeja. Mä otan nyt tästä Helsingin Sanomien NYT-liitteestä, luen pätkän. Tämä julkaistiin Helsingin Sanomissa tämä juttu, siis NYT-liitteessä vuonna 2018, silloin kun tämä itse huijaus tuli julkiseksi. Ja näistä julkaistuista artikkeleista Helsingin Sanomien NYT-liitteessä kirjoitettiin näin. Koirapuistoja käsittelevässä artikkelissa väitettiin, että koirien keskinäinen nylkyttäminen koirakentällä on osoitus koirien raiskauskulttuurista ja että myös miehiä voisi kouluttaa kuten koiria, jotta miesten taipumus seksuaaliseen väkivaltaan voitaisiin kitkeä pois. Artikkelissa oli myös mainintoja siitä, kuinka koirien omistajat olettavat koiriensa sukupuolen ja väite, että tutkija oli käsikopelolla tarkastanut koirapuistossa käyneiden koirien sukuelimet. Toisessa artikkelissa paheksuttiin heteromiesten yleisesti kokemaa vastenmielisyyttä harrastaa masturbaatiota anaalisesti ja ehdotettiin dildon laittamista takapuoleen keinona taistella homohysteriaa, transhysteriaa ja transfobiaa vastaan. Edelleen Helsingin Sanomien NYT-liitteessä kirjoitetaan yhdestä artikkelista näin. Kirjoittajat kirjoittivat uusiksi luvun Hitlerin taisteluni kirjasta, mutta vaihtoivat natsien käyttämien termien tilalle feministisen tutkimuksen käyttämiä termejä. Ja huomatkaa, että nämä ovat siis artikkeleita, jotka julkaistiin. No nyt tästä huijauksesta on kulunut 3-4 vuotta noin suurin piirtein ja soitin James Lindsaylle, haastattelin häntä. Ja puhuimme muun muassa siitä, että miten huijaus on vaikuttanut hänen elämäänsä, mitä järjettömyyksiä woke-aktivismissa tällä hetkellä on meneillään, ja aikovatko he vielä joskus tehdä uuden vastaavan huijauksen. Tämä nyt nähtävä haastattelu on tekstitetty suomeksi, mutta korostan, että tekstitys on tekoälyn tekeleitä, eli automaattinen käännös, algoritmi on tuon tekstityksen englannista suomeksi tehnyt, joten sallinette muutamat hassut käännöskukkaset, joita siellä aina aika ajoin esiintyy, mutta uskon kyllä, että valtaosa katsojista pystyy päättelemään koko ajan, mistä puhutaan. Tässä se tulee James Lindsayn haastattelu. Hello, James.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Great. I just called you via Skype, and I saw your face, but you didn't see me, I think.
I saw you wave, and then it froze.
Okay.
And it didn't progress any further, so I don't know what happened with the Skype.
Okay, it might be something to do with the internet connection. It's not the best possible here at my studio. Well, whatever, we can do it this way. So all I do then is just I'll put your still photo or something in the picture, and that's it. I think this works fine. Even at least the line is good. I can hear you very clearly here. So
okay, wonderful.
My name is Ivan Puopolo, and as I told you, I'm a journalist in Finland. I work for the television morning show MTV3. It's a commercial TV channel here in Finland. But I do run this YouTube channel as well. And I'm very honored you said yes to my request. Very nice to hear from you. Where are you at the moment?
I am at my home in Knoxville, Tennessee in the United States.
Right. So, and the time there is 11 a.m. or something like that?
Yeah, they're about 11 a.m.
Yeah, okay. So, we are all very familiar with your grievance study hoax. It was covered here in Finland pretty nicely, which is surprisingly in some sense. But, I mean, if you think back, it was few years ago, and if you remember that time, again, once it was done, what have been the most severe consequences in your life after doing the hoax?
For me, there were only a few minor consequences because I don't have an institution that I answer to. So for me, I received quite a bit of harassment online, and but I think in the end, it balanced out to the positive. I got more praise than harassment. My colleague Peter, however, who did the hoax project with us, was at Portland State University, and he went through an entire ordeal as a result of that. And if you ever want to speak with him, he can tell you at length all of the different trials the university administration put him through. They charged him with a number of violations, ethics violations for doing the experiment, accused him of falsifying data, and all of these different things, and put him through all these different trials at the university that finally led this year. It took so much of a toll on him, it finally led to his resignation from the university this year.
I know. Actually, I tried to reach him a couple of months ago when this happened, but I never got in contact with him. So what is he doing now?
Right now, Peter, as far as I know, he's producing a large volume of mostly video materials and going around and speaking different places. I think he's going to actually be coming to Europe through part of the winter, or at least the spring, into the spring. And so he's mostly trying to produce as many video materials as he can to try to explain this problem to people from his perspective, and the problem of the social justice scholarship, if you want, or the woke scholarship, depending on which term you like to use for it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Well, at the time you released this hoax on YouTube channel, I think it was at first, and I don't know, later maybe somewhere else. But the reaction from the scientific community was very bad. They didn't accept it at all, and I was just wondering, did you receive any understanding from the scientific community, from somewhere else, like from Department of Physics or Biology, or somewhere from real science?
Yes, to a degree. We actually, the response was quite split. The softer sciences, sociology, psychology, and so on, became quite mad at us and were very, very bad about us. And the humanities departments were very angry with us for the most part. Political science departments, which skew slightly conservative, tended to be very happy with us. The hard sciences were split. Many scientists reached out and told us that we had embarrassed the university, we'd embarrassed academia, and that was bad. But others, for example, university in Dresden, Germany, invited us over and awarded us the title of Heroes of Science, a neuroscience department at the university in Dresden, technological university in Dresden, and invited us over and awarded us, quite an honor. So there was a split. The harder sciences, people who are more deeply invested in getting empirical data, were slightly more positive, but the softer sciences tended to be quite angry with us.
Have you been in any contact with these journals since you've done this hoax?
No, they cut contact off pretty much completely. A handful of the editors released statements online, mostly saying that we were very mean and very deceptive, and that it was, very wrong of us to do this. But I tried to reach out to the editor of the journal Hypatia, which is the highest ranking journal we ended up getting papers accepted by, and the Journal of Feminist Philosophy. It's the highest journal of feminist philosophy. And we urged them to stand by the academic paper that they had accepted and to publish it as they had intended, because they agreed with the argument until they realized that we didn't. And we never heard back from them. Mm-hmm. A neuroscientist in England wrote an academic paper that was published last year arguing the same thing, that the papers that we wrote that didn't use fabricated data should in fact be retained in the journals that accepted them or published as they were accepted. And so this is another issue of contention in the broader academic community. If they accepted the papers, and obviously false data doesn't belong anywhere in the journal literature, but if they accepted the papers and they were merely based on philosophical argument, then we think they should stand by them. And I tried to urge Hypatia to do that, and this other academic has now urged the journals to do this, but they haven't done so.
Mm-hmm. At the time you did this hoax, were you working for the university? Were you a researcher yourself, or what did you do then?
No, I had left the university a number of years earlier because of the university, at least in North America, having shifted its primary focus to retention of students. So the last few years, I left the university in 2010, and so this was in 2017 and 18 when we did this. Mm-hmm. But the last few years, 2008, 9, 7, maybe even 8, 9, 10, that I was in the university, all of my faculty meetings were the same theme. It was, don't fail students, don't make them lose their scholarships, keep the students in, keep the students happy. You can only fail one student or two students, and I taught mathematics, so failing one or two students made my job almost impossible. Give extra credit, curve the grade, find ways to get their grades up. And I didn't want to participate in this any longer because I didn't think that that's what higher education should be about, so I left the university in 2010. So I was not. My wife was running a small business at the time all along, and I started to work alongside her. So as funny as it sounds, now that the cat is out of the bag, I talk about what we did. I was actually a licensed massage therapist, a body worker at the time. So, this is extra embarrassing for these journals that a massage therapist and a woman with a master's degree and no PhD and a educational philosophy professor at a small university were able to kind of pull the wool over their eyes.
Yeah. Are you planning to do any more of this hoax?
Well, we had actually thought about it, as you might imagine, and looking at the state of the journals now, I see that there's no need. In fact, I don't think we could make up something ridiculous enough fast enough, because we've talked about various ideas. Oh, it would be, we get on the phone, we say, this would be funny, that would be make an impact. And then a month later, we find that, some major journal, even a medical journal, has already published this idea. And so they're writing their hoaxes faster than we could make them up at this point. So there's no point. And I think, the society is now polarized around within people who understand what's going on with academia. It's polarized. There are people who know that there's a massive problem in academia that's connected to its publishing, and they're not going to be informed of anything. And then there are people who are in denial of this problem, and they are also very unlikely to be informed of anything. And so while we've talked about it, there's not much point. You can just read the articles themselves that they're actually publishing. They're publishing exactly the kind of things that we would publish if we were trying to hoax these. Like, for example, in medical journals right now, they're publishing article after article about how racism is a public health catastrophe and how there have to be all these changes in medicine to prioritize race and all of these things over, medical care. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we would have thought was a perfect joke even 12 months ago.
What do they mean by that? Racism is a problem.
This can get as complicated as you want to go. Yeah. They have a concept that they use. It's called the social determinants of health. And this is a purely repurposed Marxist concept that the social environment structures society in such a way that it has material and psychological and sociological outcomes that are basically determined by the social environment or the material environment. And so they'll say that the racism that they say organizes society, critical race theory, is the belief that racism organizes society, causes differential health outcomes, and so that racism itself is the biggest public health crisis. Really? And so there are even ham-fisted attempts to fix this. For example, a teaching college associated with Harvard in Boston already is using race preference care in their cardiology ward. So they're actually prioritizing based on race. They tried to do this with the coronavirus vaccine as well. They came out all last year saying they were going to prioritize access by race. And of course, this blew up in their faces because many Black Americans saw this as an attempt to use an experimental vaccine on Black Americans first, and rejected it and increased their vaccine hesitancy. But this idea of a social determinant for health is kind of core to their this ideological shift that's happened in all throughout academia, all throughout even medicine now. Mm-hmm. And so this is the hot topic. This is the thing that you have to bend the knee to, and that's really what we were trying to show with our grievance studies papers. If you bend the knee to this, then you can get published, and if you go against it, then you can't. At the time, it was only in humanities journals, mm-hmm. feminist journals, race journals, etc., education journals, and now it's even in medicine. It's even creeping into, there was a paper about physics that talked about white empiricism, saying that white physicists have a lower empirical standard given to them than Black physicists. So just to throw out an ugly name from history, this is a reproduction of the project of Trofim Lysenko, but across all of academic scholarship, not just agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've noticed this as well, that the wokeism, or is that a word? Whatever, is expanding to hard sciences as well. Biology, maybe. They're now trying to, starting to rethink biological sex in biology. So there is a spectrum.
As a matter of fact, they had a paper. There's a paper that we detailed and cited, and I've quoted from it many times since, from 2016 by two women's studies professors at Arizona State University, Brianne Fahs, F-A-H-S, and Michael Karger. And this paper is called Women's Studies as a Virus. I don't kid. They compare themselves to AIDS, Ebola, and HIV, and cancer, and say that those are positive metaphors for their project. And they mention biology explicitly. They say that they want to take undergraduate biology students in universities and train them in women's studies and these other ideologies. And then when they go to graduate school, they can infect that graduate school department with women's studies or critical race theory or whatever else, just like a virus. And that's the thesis of their paper. I don't exaggerate at all, as unbelievable as it sounds. So biology is a target. One of our fake papers in the grievance studies affair called for a feminist astronomy, and we submitted that to a women's studies journal, and the peer reviewers wrote back and said, we've had great success at penetrating into the soft sciences, but we've made very little progress into the harder sciences, which is our ultimate goal. So that would have been in 2018. They were saying, we can't get into physics, we can't get into mathematics and so on, but we really want to. And now, 3 years later, they are. Mm-hmm. They're in physics, in my own field of mathematics, the Mathematical Association of America and the American Mathematics Society, the two biggest professional organizations, publish stuff of this sort all the time now.
Yeah. So this leads me to this question that I had in mind earlier, that if you think of this woke activism, do you think it's just a temporary phenomena, like, let's say there was this Occupy Wall Street 10, 20 years ago, which was just a couple of years going on, and then it all of a sudden it disappeared completely. Do you think woke activism is this kind of a phenomena, or is it going to last and expand to be like a real religion and stay here tens, maybe hundreds of years?
That's a hard question. I think that it is not like Occupy Wall Street. In fact, this woke is what broke or destroyed Occupy Wall Street. It didn't just vanish. They actually made it go woke. And in fact, many of the organizers in Occupy Wall Street, who happened to be white men, very talented, organizers, activists, gave up because they were so frustrated, because they introduced these woke ideas and this intersectionality idea under what was called a progressive stack. One of our fake papers was about that, in fact, about the progressive stack and how it came into Occupy Wall Street, and then we said it should come into education as well in that paper. And they actually made it so internally argumentative and divisive that it actually dissolved Occupy Wall Street from within. I think the answer to your question is that the woke is a bid to take over society almost exactly like the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and it will last as long as we let it last. This is an attempted cultural revolution, exactly like using very similar methods as Mao used to take over society at the cultural level, and we see what happened in China. I think we're on a similar trajectory throughout the entire Western world, and that's very scary and unfortunate. But so that the answer is then it will last for as long as we allow it to last. Some people will probably continue to believe this in a kind of religious way for a long time still. But it's also so internally contradictory and so divisive and so unpleasant that I don't think it will, if we end up resisting it and it does not gain power, I think it won't stick around very long. But if people tell me all the time, this is so contradictory, it can't last very long, it'll collapse under its own weight. And I remind them that the Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight, but it took 70 years. So it could be around for a while. The Chinese Communist Party is still very much in power. They use these techniques, by the way, people don't know this. These same techniques were used by the Second International Communist Party through the CCP against the Kuomintang in China in the 1920s and 1930s. The race issue. Critical race theory had a practice run in China in the 1930s.
Really?
Where it was under the billing of the Han race of China. The Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, came in and they tried to make one people out of China. A Chinese Nationalist Party obviously would try to nationalize all of China, and they wanted to call people Chinese people. And in the goal to call them Chinese people, they made this flag that has the 5 colors of the different races. They're unified, and the CCP came alongside and integrated with Mao Zedong was a member of the CCP in 1923 and also joined the Kuomintang and infiltrated from within. And what they started to do was to say that the Kuomintang was trying to force all Chinese people to abandon their racial heritage and become Han Chinese. The new Chinese people were all going to be, Hua. It was the Chinese word for it. Huarun, Chinese person. The Huarun were all going to be the same. And so what they said was these are racial imperialists who are forcing all Chinese people to be Han people. And then the Chinese Communist Party positioned itself as the so-called good Hans. We're Han, but we're good. We're going to actually liberate you racially. And critical race theory played out in almost perfect parallel through the 1930s going into the 1940s in China, culminating in the 1949 revolution where the CCP took over and pushed out the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, overthrew Chiang Kai-shek. And so this same process played out in China starting in the 1930s or 1920s, really, up to 1949. And then, obviously, the Great Leap Forward was a disaster, and they kicked Mao out of power, and he came back with this cultural revolution through the schools. And this is the same thing we see happening in the West. They tried revolutions in the 60s that were very radical and violent, and into the early 70s, and we kicked them out of power and out of society, and they all went into education, following the same model that Mao used. And now our education system is very similar. The model is very similar. The youth are the ones who are radicalized. The movement comes from the students. That's why there's so much emphasis on this scholarship being perverted that we exposed with the grievance studies. It's all a very big, ugly problem. So, yeah, I don't think it's just going to go away on its own. It must be resisted, but it's also very unpleasant. So I don't think it'll stick around if it's resisted.
Yeah, but there are these, when you think of woke and then, let's say, Marxism or even communism, you can see these similarities between those two things. And I can see why it appeals somewhere else in the world. But why does it appeal in the United States? Because, USA Americans hate communism, they hate Marxism, and they love, free market and capitalism. So why does woke gain so much popularity in United States?
Because we're narcissists. That's the short answer. Because Americans, as much as they love capitalism and they allegedly love money, Americans also love themselves. and that is our great weakness. And so these identity politics achieve two things. One is that they focus in on yourself, and nothing's ever your fault or your problem. You are the great, excellent person by virtue of whatever, and the society is designed to work against you so that you don't make any success. So it appeals to that kind of entitlement, that kind of narcissism, that also is a negative but somewhat true stereotype of many Americans. So it appeals there, but it also hides the fact that it's communism. I resisted the belief that this was Marxist at all until finally I read over the past 3 years so much of this, and so many ties back to Marx, or so many ties back to the critical Marxists of the mid-20th century, that I finally was overcome, and I finally had to confess that, I had been wrong all along, saying this is not Marxist, that's incorrect. This is Marxism dressed up in identity politics instead of being dressed up in economic politics. And by shifting into these social issues and cultural issues, rather than and tapping into the individual narcissism, it actually disguised itself. I think there are many, many people who push these, whether it's the critical race theory, whether it's the queer theory, whether it's the gender theory, that push these things without even knowing themselves that it's in fact Marxism. So they're pushing Marxism without knowing that they're pushing Marxism, because it's shifted in its focus and taken up the mantle of civil rights, which for the last 55 years in the United States has been kind of the shining star of moral goodness, is to be on the side of what looks like civil rights. And so there's a lot of factors they were able to exploit to create a Marxism that doesn't look like Marxism, and that feeds into the conceits and the pride of Americans. Some of that pride, like the civil rights movement, being well-deserved and something we should be proud of, and some of that pride being the kind of standard entitlement that comes with being a very, very rich and fortunate society for a very long time.
Yeah, so they're kind of useful idiots in that way, some way.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, however, despite of all you say right now, there's been some signs that even the liberal media, New York Times, for example, they hired this guy, I don't know, how do you pronounce this name? John McWhorter? Do you know what I mean?
McWhorter, yeah.
Whorter, yeah. The author of Woke Racism. So that's clearly sign of that the paper is New York Times, so it's the most woke newspaper in the world probably. But they hired this guy. So what do you think of that? This is the kind of thing that happens. I don't think that the New York Times, even as far as it is now after the 1619 Project, et cetera, and after their firing, the big firing they had last year of their editors, I don't think it's completely all the way locked in. I think there's still internal struggle going on. I think they also have to keep up the semblance of being fair and balanced to some degree, so that they don't lose the liberal population that doesn't realize that all of this is kind of the Marxist maneuver that it is. And again, like I said, I don't think everybody understands fully that it is this Marxist push. But and John, I know John is certainly not a Marxist as far as I can tell in any regard. He's not a bad guy. He's not woke. He's in fact very not woke. But if you have a few of those people on staff, and you have a few, 1 out of 8 articles or 1 out of 5 articles pushes back the other way, it doesn't look like pure ideological conformity, and so the propaganda becomes more effective. Yeah. Okay. I read this article in Finland. It's quite big newspaper that they wrote about politics in the United States, and the reporter wrote that he lives in America, and he wrote that the woke activism within the Democratic Party has been shifting so far away, from the everyday life that people live there. People who are Democrats, but the woke wing within the Democratic Party has been shifting so far away from the everyday life that they don't find anymore anyone to vote within the Democratic Party. So they are shifting to Republicans, even though they are not Republicans themselves. So this was this guy's opinion piece, maybe. But is this true? Do you see this there in America? You live there.
Yes, it's actually kind of begun. I was visiting one of the most left-wing counties in the United States, which is in Northern Virginia, just by Washington, D.C. That's Loudoun County, Virginia. Very famous now in the news across the world because they've had many scandals. But this is where most of the richest people from Washington, D.C. live, is just outside of the city. And this is also a huge tech corridor, so there's a lot of very wealthy people there, and a very wealthy school district, and they vote very strongly Democrat, and they're one of the most liberal counties. It's certainly the most liberal in Virginia, and that county almost switched. When I was there in the summer in August, just a few months ago, they were saying, well, this is a huge problem. We've had enough of this, but we must find a Democrat who will fight against it because we can't possibly vote Republican. And then we had the election in the governor's election that they had in November, so just 3-4 months later, and the Republican won. Mm-hmm. And the vote demographics in almost every county in Virginia shifted toward the Republican candidate, and you had many Democrats vote for Republicans who never had done before. So there are a lot of people now who are holding their nose to vote against Democrats, even though they are not Republicans, because they don't like this woke stuff. It's very damaging. And then the scary part is I think that the Democrats in power know this. I think that they know that they've pushed their agenda far too hard and they've alienated far too much of the population. And so that they have, the result of that, the old saying is that from Rome, is that they've crossed the Rubicon. Mm-hmm. And they know they can't go back, which means they can only do one thing, which is to continue to, as we say, double down and to push the politics harder and to try to drive their agenda because they know that they're crashing the plane, if you will.
Yeah. So there's also been this huge debate in the United States over the critical race theory that it's been taught at schools. To young kids, maybe, as far as I know. What's the situation with the critical race theory now there at schools in the United States? Do they teach
critical race theory? Yes, but they don't. This is a trick that people must understand, and I don't know how important it is for Finns, but maybe very important to understand because this is the kind of trick the cultural communists always use, which is that they say that they're not teaching critical race theory, and what they mean when they say that is that they're not teaching the formal theory out of, the graduate level law textbooks. But what they're doing is they're applying the principles. They're teaching the children to think in terms of racial stratification and that there's a conflict across race lines so that there's a power dynamic like systemic racism or white supremacy that's characterized the country all along, and that there are the winners from that, the people who are the racial bourgeoisie, the whites, and then there are the losers from that who are the racial proletariat, who are all the other racial minorities, and then there are those within the whites who become allies that are in solidarity with the proletariat, who are very much like the vanguard that Lenin put forth, and the good whites, or the good Han, as it were, in China. So, this is a very Bolshevik strategy, but at the cultural level. And so they say they are not teaching it, but this is a trick of language. They're not teaching the formal theory, but they're putting all of the ideas into practice and teaching those ideas. Racial privilege, the outcome being racial equity on its way to racial justice, which is in perfect parallel to teaching that we're going to enforce socialism on our way to communism. It's an exact parallel in the racial dimension instead of the class dimension. And they're teaching those concepts all the way down to very, very young children before kindergarten. So 3-4 years old, they're beginning it already, trying to raise a racial consciousness in perfect parallel to raising a class consciousness. And that consciousness is society's divided. There are certain groups who are unfair winners, and then everybody else is their loser, and there's a conflict there across that divide. Mm-hmm. And that's how you must understand the world. And so that is what they are teaching, which is the heart of critical race theory. And it's infused. I've spoken with school districts across the entire United States, over 30 states, and It's in school districts in virtually every state, probably every state. It may be in every school district in the country. And certain districts have it worse than others. I just spoke, in fact, with a very large district in Texas, the richest district in Texas, which is near Austin. And they told me that their director of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion explicitly said, they asked him, what does equity mean? And he says, well, it depends on a critical consciousness. And a critical consciousness is, of course, a Marxist concept. And then he said, well, it applies to race, and it applies to gender, and it applies to all of these other factors. So this is exactly identity politics-based Marxism being brought in under brand names like diversity, equity, and inclusion, or under the brand name in California of ethnic studies. I worked with the Orange County School Board there and saw how bad it is throughout California, and their state has now mandated that. The state of Oregon has also mandated it, and the state of Washington has also mandated it. The state of New York is mandating it. The state of Virginia has a program called Ed Equity Virginia that is mandating it. And it's all written by, if you look at the authors, it's written by people who are well-known critical race theorists, like, for example, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who wrote a paper, the first paper in 1995 called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. And so it's definitely throughout all of the schools and probably all throughout the country, but they're no longer calling it critical race theory. They're hiding that fact. They hide it under many different brand names. So they can keep bringing it in and keep doing it and keep enforcing it on children.
Yeah, how do parents react on this?
They're not happy. Parents everywhere I go are increasingly angry that the schools are programming their children to think in terms of race and racial division, and to think that certain races have an automatic leg up and other races have an automatic oppression put onto them. And that society's actually supposed to, or it's not supposed to, but that society actually works that way. And unless they become activists, will continue to work that way forever. And that they're no longer teaching, basic subjects. In fact, people talk about the learning loss from the pandemic and distance schooling and all of this, but the learning loss because of this critical education is so much worse. Our numbers in reading, our numbers in mathematics, our numbers in science are just absolutely the lowest that they've been in decades. And part of the reason is that the classes are being repurposed, not to teach, say, mathematics, but to teach what might be called ethnomathematics from a position of critical race theory. Ethnomathematics. I saw an example, and this is a perfect parallel to education that Mao did. It's a perfect parallel to education that was done in other communist regimes. There's an example I saw yesterday that to teach children about graphs, bar graphs, instead of just saying this is how the bar graph works and here's an example of a bar graph, the example that they used was based off of this so-called implicit association test, and it purported to show that conservatives are more racist than progressives. People on the right more racist than people on the left. And so you can see the obvious point. But then a friend of mine, a Chinese woman who actually lived through the Cultural Revolution, also shared yesterday an example from one of the textbooks when she was in China and in their education when Mao was in power. And it actually showed, there's a very simple math problem, like if there are 4 capitalists and they do this and 3 capitalists and they do that, how many capitalists are exploiting the proletariat or whatever, something like this. And it says in the top, always remember class consciousness. And so it's shuttling in a communist indoctrination under the guise of teaching mathematics. And their books are filled with examples of how you can do this. And so parents are angry. They're very angry. We have the largest number of parents that have pulled their children out of public schooling in the United States in our entire country's history. Huge drop. Almost 10% of the students have been pulled out across the country just the last year. And so parents are extremely angry about this, and they have every right to be.
Yeah, okay, I hear you. So one more final question, James Lindsay. Have you ever been tried to has anyone ever been tried to cancel you? I'm not sure if I'm making this sentence properly, but do you know what I mean? What are the attempts against you? Yeah.
Yes, actually. Since I don't have an institution over me that can fire me or pressure me, it's much more difficult to cancel me than it is for, say, other people. But what they have done is they take out of context things that I've said, or they'll take things that I've put on social media and skew them in a particular way. There's a very broad narrative on social media that I assert is obviously very false, that I'm rampantly anti-Semitic, and they find every possible thing that I say that they can take out of context to try to support this assertion. And they actually go to other people that I've worked with, my other colleagues and friends, and relentlessly pressure them, send them messages, badger them on social media, and try to get them to denounce me, which is, again, creating a Maoist struggle session environment. It's the exact same thing as the Cultural Revolution. And so there are these kind of rampant attempts to get people that used to work with me or that still work with me to denounce me publicly and to cut all ties from me. And some of them have.
They have, they have succeeded.
Yeah, in some cases. Some people have stuck with me. Other people have just kind of quietly backed away a little bit. And some people have openly, said things like, well, I used to believe in him, but he's gone crazy now and whatever. So, yeah, there have been some attempts that have been moderately successful. But what can you do but continue?
But how do you make your living? You said that you don't have any organization or anything behind you. So where do you get your money from?
I made my own organization. So I haven't been canceled in the proper way yet. I am all crowdsourced funded. So I have a Patreon. I have all of those. So I make all the money that I make, except if I get invited to speak or book royalties. All the money that I make comes from everyday people contributing a few dollars here and there, with the occasional person who throws in a little bit more. I don't have any big source of funding. I don't have, a tie to some think tank or some university or anything like that where I receive a salary. But I made my own company, and the company makes enough money to make sure that I can eat. And so since they haven't cut off my ability to do that, that's how I fund myself.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, James Lindsay, for this phone call. I know you have to go. You have a hard stop at 12 there, so it's 15 minutes more. So thank you very much, and have a nice day in United States, and Merry Christmas as well.
Oh, yeah, thank you. You guys too.